Why was there a fighter aircraft bold enough to turn its back on almost every rule of the game in the sky, to trample on the very standards everyone worshipped, then become the name that Allied pilots feared and respected throughout World War II? Behind it stood a designer who refused to walk the beaten path, and what he created stunned the Allies, outlived every expectation, and forced the entire world to rethink how fighters should be built: the Focke-Wulf 190. But before we can understand why it was called the Butcher Bird, we have to go back to the original context, the late 1930s, when Germany already had in its hands one of the fastest and most modern fighters in the world: the Messerschmitt Bf 109. In the early years of the war, the Bf 109 proved more than capable of standing toe-to-toe with the finest fighters of Britain and France. It was almost the textbook template for the modern fighter of its day: a small, slender fuselage, aerodynamically optimized, built to dive into high-speed dogfights. But behind that glittering facade was a design philosophy full of trade-offs. And not everyone in the Luftwaffe was convinced that this was the right path for the future of air warfare. The fuselage was so small that there was almost no room left for comfort or long-term robustness. The cockpit was cramped with restricted visibility. More dangerous still, the landing gear was very narrow, retracting outward into the wings to save weight and drag. That helped increase top speed, but it turned takeoff and landing into a real gamble. There are estimates that around 1,700 German pilots, especially the less experienced ones, were killed simply taking off or landing the Bf 109. Its liquid-cooled inline engine made it even more fragile. A single hit to the cooling lines could be enough to shut the engine down within seconds. It was in this context that the German Air Ministry was forced to order a second frontline fighter, not to replace the Bf 109, but as a fallback option in case the enemy introduced a superior rival. One of the firms that answered the Air Ministry's call was Focke-Wulf, led by Chief Engineer Kurt Tank. But while many of his contemporaries thought only in terms of squeezing a few more kilometers per hour of speed or a few more meters per second of climb out of the Bf 109 airframe, Tank went in a completely different direction. He had been a soldier in World War I, had tasted real frontline weather and chaos, and he understood that real war had very little in common with clean test flights off perfectly paved concrete runways. In reality, airstrips were often nothing more than muddy stretches of earth thrown together in a hurry. Ground crews were short on manpower, short on time, and short on training. So in Tank's view, an aircraft had to be a tool that could survive that environment, easy to repair, easy to maintain, and still flyable, even after taking hits in sensitive spots. From those very down-to-earth ideas, the FW-190 was conceived from the outset as a multi-role combat aircraft, a rugged airframe that could take on many missions, not just hang around in air superiority duels like the 109. Tank's first against the current decision was to choose the BMW 801 air-cooled radial engine, a powerful 14-cylinder beast that could sustain significant damage and still bring its pilot home. At the time, many European experts saw radial engines as outdated for frontline fighters. But Kurt Tank was looking farther ahead. He understood that war does not favor fragile machines. Radials tolerated harsh conditions, better demanded less delicate care, and when hit by enemy fire, still gave the pilot a fighting chance to get back. He didn't stop there. He also rescued the pilot right from the runway. The FW-190's landing gear retracted inwards from the wings, giving it a wide, stable stance on the ground, and sharply reducing takeoff and landing accidents. The cockpit was raised with a clear, blown canopy roomier, and more neatly laid out so that a pilot could step in and immediately understand what he was looking at, learn quickly, and fight more confidently. At a glance, none of these details looked glamorous, but they revealed very clearly Kurt Tank's brutally practical mindset. He was not trying to create a showpiece, but a tool of war, simple, easy to use, easy to service. That ran counter to a lot of German habits at the time, a nation enamored with overcomplicated tanks, hard-to-maintain machinery, and exotic projects that were nearly impossible to sustain in the long run. When the first prototype took off in 1939, it was obvious this was a very different kind of Iron Bird, heavier than the Bf-109, the Messerschmitt, but more solid, more robust, and more flexible in its mission profile. It was not built to set records. It was built to work day after day in wartime. By the summer of 1941, when the FW-190 appeared over Western Europe, the Allies were genuinely stunned. RAF pilots who had grown used to facing Bf-109s suddenly met a strange new opponent. It climbed fast, rolled like lightning, and carried far heavier firepower. Most worrying of all, it could soak up punishment. It could be hit badly and still stay in the fight. This was no longer a fighter that merely looked good on paper. It was a machine built to survive in the middle of fire and steel. At first, British and American intelligence were so confused, they thought this might just be a refurbished French design. Only when they realized that this was a completely new German fighter did the real anxiety begin. There was even talk of sending in a commando team to infiltrate an airfield and capture both an aircraft and its pilot, just to find out what this thing was that kept outclassing the Spitfire in the skies. Ironically, the answer arrived in a far simpler way. A German pilot flying an FW-190, having just shot down a Spitfire, got lost in bad weather and accidentally landed at a British airfield. In a single moment of error, both the pilot and his intact aircraft fell straight into Allied hands. It was the intelligence gift they had been waiting for. Up to that point, the Spitfire Mach 5 had been Britain's pride and Germany's most troublesome opponent. Yet once the FW-190 appeared, the Spitfire was almost dethroned overnight. At low and medium altitudes, the very altitudes where most real dogfights happen, the FW-190 enjoyed near total superiority. It rolled faster, accelerated better in level flight, and carried significantly heavier armament. The early FW-190s packed a real punch. In the nose were two 7.92mm machine guns above the engine, and in the wings, 4 20mm cannon, 2 in the wing roots and 2 outboard. For a single pilot sitting alone in the cockpit, that kind of firepower in 1941 was enough to make many opponents think twice before pressing the attack. And that was only the beginning. Even more extreme weapons configurations would follow. In the nose sat the BMW 801, a 14-cylinder twin-row radial that pushed the FW 190 to about 410 mm, roughly 660 km/h at medium altitude. Standard output was around 1,600 horsepower, and later upgrades pushed that figure above 1,900. Fully loaded with fuel and weapons, the aircraft weighed around 800 pounds, nearly 4 tons. Heavy, yes, but the airframe was strong and the engine powerful. This was exactly the machine Kurt Tank wanted, not just strong, but durable enough to endure a long, grinding war. The FW-190 was also equipped with an automatic engine control system that handled fuel mixture supercharger settings and propeller pitch. The pilot didn't have to keep looking down to twist knobs and levers while desperately scanning the sky for enemies. He could just fly and fight. Another thing people rarely mention the FW-190 was relatively kind to fly. The controls were smooth, the aircraft stable, and the cockpit layout was clear and logical, making it easier for young pilots rush through training to master it quickly. As Germany gradually lost its cadre of veteran aces that became a life-or-death difference, a fighter that was powerful, easier to maintain than the Bf-109, and more pilot-friendly. That is why the FW-190 kept its place at the front right up to the end of the war. But you probably didn't click on a video just to hear about bolts and mechanics. You want to see the FW-190 thrown into battle and understand why it earned the name Butcher Bird. Less than a year after entering service, the Focke-Wulf 190 had already been turned into a kind of aerial Swiss Army knife, flying close air support for ground troops, acting as an interceptor, and even being tested as a night fighter. From the moment it appeared, it overshadowed the Spitfire Mk5 so badly that for a time, British pilots were actually advised to avoid engaging the 1-90 if possible. That urgency forced Britain to rush the Spitfire Mk9 into frontline service. Then in late 1942, the color of the air war changed again. Formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators grew thicker and thicker, and Allied bombing raids increased in both tempo and scale. This was the moment when the Butcher Bird had to prove itself against a completely new kind of enemy. Bombers of that era were not flying undefended. They were designed as real flying fortresses, flying in tight formations that created overlapping fields of defensive fire, and each aircraft could mount up to 13 heavy 50 caliber 12.7 mm machine guns. Charging straight into such a formation was like diving into a wall of lead. At the same time, the rhythm and scale of the raids were ramping up week after week. By night, it was the RAF's turn. By day, it was the Americans. The curtain of bombs left almost no gaps. Night fighting is a story we'll come back to later. The The Bf-109 could still climb up to intercept, but it was clearly not the ideal tool. Its firepower was too light, and its slender airframe made it vulnerable to that defensive hail of bullets. The Focke-Wulf 190 told a different story. Stronger, more resilient, and built from the outset with heavier armament, it was naturally suited to the role of bomber killer. The Luftwaffe quickly developed specialized interceptor variants extra armor for the pilot underwing racks for additional 20mm maters and even 30mm cannon. Firepower shot up dramatically, but the price was speed and maneuverability. And that was only the first step. The German engineers went on to test even bolder experimental solutions. From 1943 onward, a large tube began to appear under the wings of some FW-190s. That was the 21 cm rocket launcher meant to attack bomber formations from a distance. These rockets were not particularly accurate, and they made the aircraft heavier and more sluggish. But they didn't need pinpoint hits. They only had to streak into the middle of the tight B-17 and B-24 formations explode and spray shrapnel. A well-timed salvo could shake an entire formation, damaging multiple aircraft at once. They were first used on a large scale during the second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. That day, the rocket-armed fighters helped turn the mission into one of the bloodiest for American bomber crews. About 60 aircraft were lost, and hundreds of men did not come back. Once the formation had been torn apart by rockets, other fighters dived in to keep attacking. But that advantage did not last. In 1944, when long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Frus Mustang arrived, they could stay with the bombers deep into German airspace and directly engage the interceptors. FW-190s loaded with rockets already sluggish because of the huge drag became easy targets. In theory, the pilots could jettison the launchers after firing, but often it was too late to escape the Mustangs waiting for them. And even so, this still wasn't the strangest role the FW-190 would be forced into. The next chapter took place in the darkness of the night sky. Compared to the daylight missions flown by the Americans, Britain's night bombing raids suffered far lower losses. That created enormous pressure on Germany's air defense system. Dedicated night fighters like the Bf-110 were too few in number and relied almost completely on ground-based radar and controllers to guide them. In that situation, the Germans chose a solution that many officers initially thought was insane, sending single-seat FW-190 fighters into the night sky with no radar, no guidance, and virtually no supporting network. The tactic was given the name Wild Boar. Their mission sounded simple, but it was chilling patrol above cities already engulfed in flames, using the fire's explosions and beams of searchlights to spot the silhouettes of enemy bombers. Once they found one, they had to stalk it close in and open fire while flying straight through their own flak. Many never came back. Yet in 1943, this rule-breaking tactic still became a crucial piece of Germany's night air defenses and did bring down a significant number of bombers. Later, as the RAF improved, its jamming changed flight routes, and the flak zones became too dangerous for both sides, night interception duties shifted back toward larger twin-seat fighters, which were more suitable and safer for pilots in that role. We also can't skip the name Georg Peter Eder, one of the most effective bomber interception pilots of the entire war. In late 1942, as the skies over Europe grew ever brighter with the flashes of air raids, Eder transitioned to the FW-190. Together with his seasoned comrade Egon Mayer, he developed a completely different approach that sent chills down the spines of many Allied crews, even when they only heard about it head-on attacks. Instead of quietly sneaking up from behind as the manuals prescribed, they charged straight into the bomber formations from the front at high speed, squeezing the trigger at close range and then flashing past in a split second. One pass, one burst, one chance. It was suffocatingly dangerous but chillingly effective. The nose of a B-17 or B-24 had fewer guns covering it, and a single well-aimed burst into the cockpit area could rob an aircraft of all control. Decades later, another FW-190 story was uncovered. In 1943 near Leningrad, pilot Paul Ratz used his Focke-Wulf to attack a train at low altitude. Just as the mission seemed complete, the engine suddenly died in mid-air. With no options left, he was forced to belly land the aircraft in a soft marsh, escaping death by inches and trudging westward on foot. There he fell into Soviet hands and remained a prisoner until the end of the war. The aircraft, meanwhile, lay where it fell in a remote swamp, buried in mud and stagnant water, and that, strangely enough, is what preserved it. For more than 40 years, the FW-190 lay motionless until it was rediscovered in 1989. When the recovery team reached it, they were almost stunned the airframe was still remarkably intact, like some kind of time capsule. It was shipped to the United States and began a painstaking restoration to make it flyable again. Then the secret came out. Inside the engine, a fuel line had been plugged with a piece of cloth. That was no random malfunction, it was a deliberate act. And this was not an isolated case. During the war years, German aviation depended heavily on forced labor prisoners from occupied countries, people dragged from detention camps and labor camps. Under the watchful eyes of armed guards, many of them were put to work in engine assembly plants. For them, small acts like this could be the only possible way to resist. Sabotaging aircraft was one of the very few forms of silent resistance open to them. They knew that a forgotten screwdriver, a cut wire, or a scrap of cloth jammed deep inside a fuel line might be enough to take one aircraft out of the lineup, and possibly its pilot with it. With that FW-190 lying in the swamp, their small act had done its job. The engine failed shortly after takeoff, and Ratz was just lucky enough to survive the forced landing. He may never have known the real cause. Ironically, many decades later, that very same aircraft was restored to flying condition and took to the air again in 2011, still powered by its original BMW 801 radial engine.